Good morning, everyone. We're going to begin the briefing, and let me just say a few words to open. I want to welcome everyone, and I especially want to welcome our witnesses who took their time to come here today, some traveling very far, and we're glad that they were actually able to make it. And members of the broader DC community that are here, this is a briefing of the Congressional Black Caucus's Task Force on Foreign Affairs and Homeland Security. I want to welcome my colleagues here. First of all, the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Cedric Richmond, who has joined us today. Terry Sewell, who is a member of the Ways and Means Committee, but is also a member of the House Intelligence Committee. And then Marcia Fudge, who is right there, former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. So once again, I want to welcome everyone to this briefing that is critically important from all of our perspectives. Just a little bit of background in terms of how we got here today. Last August, when many people in the country and in the Congressional Black Caucus learned of the memo that was leaked out of the FBI that was called Black Identity Extremists, likely motivated to attack law enforcement officers. When we read that document, to me personally, it had a chilling effect. It reminded me of the past, it reminded me of the 70s, it reminded me of the COINTELPRO program. And when I thought about the activists around the country who've been involved in protesting law enforcement officers involved shootings, thinking of Black Lives Matter, thinking of the whole new generation of activists, it had an especially chilling effect, because I felt like if a memo like that was distributed to law enforcement around the country, then who's to say that in a lot of cities, a lot of towns, that the next time there was an officer-involved shooting in a protest, then who's to say that they wouldn't say that all of the protesters were Black identity extremists? And so we set out in the Congressional Black Caucus under the leadership of our chairman. We had a meeting with the FBI Director Wray, and we asked him about this, and we asked him where this concept came from. And that's one of the issues that we want to get at today. What even qualifies as a Black identity extremist? And are there groups that are likely to attack law enforcement officers? I sit on the Judiciary Committee along with the chairman, and we've just been joined by Hank Johnson from Georgia. We sit on the Judiciary Committee, and on that committee, we've questioned Sessions, Wray, Rosenstein, all asking the same question, and us receiving no answers. So hopefully our panelists today will give us an opportunity to learn where this concept might have originated, what its potential is, and offer some recommendations to us for how we might be able to combat it. So without any further ado, if any of my colleagues would like to say a few words, and then we will jump right into the panel.
Let me just thank you for coming, and I will tell you that I'm sure same thing with Hank and my colleagues, that I'm Black, I identify as Black. I protest police violence, and I'm concerned about community police relations. And according to this flawed FBI analysis, I would certainly fit the definition of a Black identity extremist. And I think that what they did was conflate and confuse, intentionally or unintentionally, a whole bunch of unconnected things to get to Black identity extremists. If they're concerned about police safety, then we would have hearings around this building, and someone would be talking about sovereign citizens, and we wouldn't be talking about a made-up category of Black identity extremists. So I just want to thank you all for coming, because this is important. And this is something that we will not let go without some checks on it, because the people that are out there, the foot soldiers in any movement, deserve to be protected and not identified in such a careless way. And I'm not worried about the New Orleans Police Department. I'm worried about Barney Fife, who got this memo that after the next shooting in their little town, that everybody that comes in the protest poses a threat of bodily harm to police officers. It's dangerous, it's reckless, and I think we should do something about it. So I thank Representative Bass for putting this together today. So thank you all.
I wanted to echo the comments of our chairman and to thank Karen Bass as well as the CBC task force for organizing today's hearing. I want to welcome all of the panelists here. I also want you all to know that we're not just doing this as a CBC task force. I sit on the House Intelligence Committee, and we have made a formal request to the FBI to come and give a full briefing in front of the entire Intelligence Committee, House Intelligence Committee, because we realize that this is very dangerous. To actually have a classification like this echoes us back to the day, harkens us back to the days of Hoover, and a serious targeting and profiling could result. And so I think in this day and age when we have a president that's undermining our intelligence community, our intelligence community, and the FBI in particular, it is really important that the public's confidence in the FBI is not further undermined. So they owe us an explanation as to why this report was put out there, and more importantly, why was it put out like this, and what solutions we can have as a effectively address this in our communities. So again, I want to commend the task force for hosting this hearing, and I look forward to our panelists' discussion.
Thank you. I want to thank Chairwoman Bass for convening us today on this very important hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for your appearance today and for your work as you have made it to this point. Your body of work speaks for you, and I think that's why you're here today. I want to thank you for that. I'll make the observation that the criminal justice system in America has had a special attraction for African Americans. Ever since slavery, Jim Crow, on into the civil rights movement up to today, the feasting on African Americans has continued unabated. And so we can't look at this FBI report on so-called Black Identity Extremism as if it is an anomaly. It's actually could be viewed as a precursor as African Americans move away from the consumerism of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and into a period of more reflection and awareness and activism. Then we have this report that reveals itself. A thorough reading of it, or careful reading of it, leads me to conclude that you take a few isolated incidents, 6 of them, and you put them together, and then you talk about how so-called Black identity extremism and the sovereign citizen movement rooted in Moorism come together to produce threats to law enforcement. There simply appears to be no basis for it. And but yet this report is released and people act on it. And so we're going to have to be very careful moving forward. So with that, I will yield back to the chair.
Thank you very much. We have been joined by Bonnie Watson-Coleman from New Jersey, and I'm going to move to introduce our witnesses and give each witness 5 minutes with opening comments, and then we will open up for questions. Dr. Earl Suthers is a former FBI, SWAT, and undercover special agent. He is currently the director of Safe Communities Institute and the director of Homegrown Violent Extremist Studies at the Price School of Public Policy at the University of California. Mike German is also undercover FBI special agent and is currently a former, and is I'm sure would have had his cover ball with him. and a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice, Liberty, and National Security at New York University Law School, and will soon be coming out with a book. I hope that you mention that in your comments. Nana Jaffe is a human rights and criminal defense attorney, and also is the vice chairperson of the Black Alliance for Justice Immigration, and an adjunct professor in the Pan-African Studies Department of the California State University of Los Angeles. Thank you very much for coming this morning. Dr. Sutters.
Congressmember Bass, and distinguished members of the Congressional Black Caucus, thank you for the opportunity to provide this statement. The purpose is to offer insight into the current landscape of domestic terrorism as it relates to the August 3rd, 2017 FBI intelligence assessment entitled Black Identity Extremists Likely Motivated to Target Law Enforcement Officers. As a former Assistant Chief of Police and FBI Special Agent, I open by thanking the brave men and women of law enforcement for their sacrifice and dedication as they protect their communities every day. They accept the reality of the danger they face, including the possibility of losing their lives and the performance of their duties. Today, the rise in violent extremism in the United States does imperil law enforcement officers, and attacks have been carried out by a diverse collection of adversaries espousing a range of ideologies. Even as this is the case, however, the FBI's assessment that Black identity extremism is a threat lacks merit. The FBI assessment stated that, quote, the FBI assesses it is very likely Black identity extremists, i.e. perceptions of police brutality against African Americans spurred an increase in premeditated, retaliatory, lethal violence against law enforcement and will very likely serve as justification for such violence. Violent extremism occurs when individuals or groups openly express their ideological beliefs through violence or a call for violence. While there are groups whose ideologies include principles of racially bias-based hatred, black supremacy, and/or separatist ideologies, the cases cited in the FBI assessment do not present evidence of racist ideology, but instead present consistent evidence of anti-government sentiments. Inasmuch as the FBI assesses it is very likely BIE suspects acted in retaliation for perceived police brutality, this further illustrates the attackers likely targeted police officers because they were representatives of the government and not due to their skin pigment. A conclusion reinforced by the fact that officers who were killed were of a variety of ethnicities. It should be noted that the FBI's domestic terrorism program identifies 9 extremist movements: white supremacy, black identity, militia, sovereign citizens, anarchists, abortion, animal rights, environmental rights, and Puerto Rican nationalists. Consider how the black identity movement is weakly defined. While the white supremacy category applies to specific organizations and groups with a defined message, black identity extremists are defined more broadly. As such, this categorization renders an individual's identity more important than their ideology, meaning violence committed by any African American could be defined as black identity extremism. The FBI assessment offers insufficient empirical data to support the alleged likelihood of so-called BIE adherence and ignores statistics as they relate to officers killed by extremists. 2 data points in particular are instructive in this regard. First, black nationalists and other leftists did not kill any police officer in 2017. Meanwhile, white supremacists and anti-government extremists fatally attacked a police officer and 2 corrections officers. Second, an Anti-Defamation League analysis of shots fired events between law enforcement and homegrown extremists between the years 2009 and 2016 reveals there were 77 shots fired incidents attributed to numerous extremist groups. Black nationalist attackers accounted for 2% of those incidents, while the extreme right wing, including white supremacists and anti-government extremists, accounted for 83%. Further exacerbating the shortcomings of the FBI assessment are the inadequacies of the 6 incidents offered in the section, quote, suspects' grievances very likely to lead to violent targeting of law enforcement. Upon closer examination, each of these cases fails to adequately demonstrate or clearly define the alleged nexus between the BIE ideology and the incident. Attackers left unnamed in the assessment were subsequently easily identified. Quote, pocket litter was deemed actionable intelligence. 2 subjects were involved in an incident instead of 1, as reported. And in one case, the police determined, quote, impairment may have been the factor instead of an extremist ideological motivation. The omission or failure to properly document sources, organizations, and individuals in an assessment such as this should be cause for concern. Local law enforcement has the best finger on the pulse of domestic threats in our communities. Police see the many challenges communities face every day, and so their views on extremist trends are valuable and informed. In that regard, key findings in the law enforcement assessment of the violent extremist threat study in 2015 of 382 law enforcement agencies in the United States found that law enforcement officers, quote, consider anti-government violent extremists to be the most severe threat of political violence they face. Effective homeland security and public safety strategies should be rooted in facts. Appropriate policies, processes, and technologies are the foundations of security. Those elements are most effective when informed by research and empirical data. If we are to enhance social morality, responsibility, and community integrity, with the intended outcome of facilitating community-based efforts to identify and explore solutions to the threat from extremism, it begins with removing policies that cultivate community animosity and stoke alienation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Jones?
Thank you, Representative Bass. Thanks for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here before the Congressional Black Caucus. I want to associate myself with all of Dr. Sutter's remarks regarding the Black Identity Extremists assessment. I think its poor analytic quality it raises a lot of questions about why it's produced. And I think taking a look at what the FBI's authorities are and how they have changed over the last several years might give us a clue about that. So that's what I wanted to focus on. But first, I wanted to make clear that I've looked at a lot of these reports, both in my time as an FBI agent and when I was a lobbyist here in D.C. with the American Civil Liberties Union and now at the Brennan Center. And this isn't unique. There have been a lot of bad reports. I wrote an article on some training materials and intelligence assessments on Black separatist extremists, which was the language they used. There was another training program on American Islamic extremists, they called it, by which they meant Black extremists. So this isn't unusual, and it's part of a larger problem that goes beyond just this one report. But taking a look at the FBI's authorities, in 2008, Attorney General Michael McCasey changed the rules that the FBI works under. And one of the sort of protected layers is that the FBI cannot investigate you for activities solely related to your First Amendment rights. Right? That sole factor test is extremely low. And even if you go back to the traditional definition of racial profiling, driving while Black, that's two factors. Right? So, but if we look at this report, the McCasey guidelines authorize a type of investigation called assessment. It's not the type of assessment this report is, but it's an actual investigation of a person or an organization. It requires, according to the Attorney General guidelines, it requires no particular factual predicate. So there needs to be no evidence that the person under investigation or the group under investigation has actually broken the law. No suspicion of that. The next stage of investigation of preliminary inquiry only requires an allegation. So this is an extremely low threshold for the FBI to start investigating. And my concern is that this document is being produced to provide the justification for this broader investigation. That if there is a Black activist who is exercising his First Amendment rights, can't be targeted based solely on that, but now we have this concept of a Black identity extremist movement that justifies the investigation. The other set of rules that are pertinent are the Justice Department guidance for the use of race in federal law. But that also has a sole factor test that race can't be a sole factor. But then it goes on that the government needs, or the FBI needs trustworthy information relevant to locality and time frame that links a person possessing a particular characteristic to an identified criminal incident, scheme, organization, or threat to national security. And I believe that this Black identity extremist assessment provides that organization scheme, threat to national security. looking at how to improve the situation, what we can do to address it. Obviously, working on amending these guidelines would be a good step. Requiring the FBI to withdraw and denounce this Black identity extremism nomenclature, I think, is critically important because I'm already seeing it pop up in state and local law enforcement materials. So it's being adopted very quickly and can cause further problems down the road. But I think more than that, we need to take a broader look at how the FBI produces these kinds of assessments, because it's not just this one assessment, and actually put in place a peer review system, which is what happened at the Department of Homeland Security after a far-right extremism report was criticized, where it actually goes to the General Counsel's office to get privacy and civil liberties reviewed before it's allowed to go off. Because I would hope that anybody who has any experience in privacy and civil liberties would look at this BIE report and say it shouldn't go forward. And finally, let me just end with what I think is a big part of the problem is the lack of diversity within the FBI. When I joined the FBI in 1988, it was still recovering from the Hoover era, and there wasn't nearly enough diversity, but it was getting better every year. Since 9/11, it's been getting worse every year. And I don't think that's just by accident. I think it has to do with the way the FBI hires, the way it disciplines its employees, and the way it conducts its activities. And I think that is something that even the last 3 directors have acknowledged is a crisis and needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you so very much. Hope you can hear me. I don't think that's on. It's on.
Hello? Okay. You know, I'm short, so I gotta pull this up a little closer. I want to thank Representative Bass for inviting me. I want to thank the task force and all of the representatives here for talking about this very important issue on a continuous basis. The fact that you folks are still hammering on it is really, really important because every hour there's a new adventure down here. And so the capacity to stay focused on something I think is extremely important. And I'm pleased to be able to talk about what is happening with activists on the ground and organizers on the ground. Because at the end of the day, we are the folks who they intend to catch up and put in prison and survey. And it's important to know what is happening already, even just in this past year and a little over this year. The FBI's Black Identity Extremist classification is a dangerous and unconstitutional policy that puts Black activists and organizers at serious risk of having our fundamental constitutional rights violated and our liberty and lives stolen. Without a shred of competent evidence, the FBI essentially and erroneously asserts that Black activists and organizers who protest or otherwise speak out against extrajudicial murders of Black people by law enforcement are motivated by a dangerous extremism that the FBI has defined as a Black identity extremism. The FBI further falsely claims that these Black identity extremists are creating an atmosphere that has led to the wanton murder of law enforcement officers, and that the creation of this atmosphere is a threat to national security. And therefore, if you're a protester, if you're an activist as a Black person speaking on this issue, you become, in essence, a domestic terrorist. And once you define as that domestic terrorist, as my esteemed colleagues have expressed, now everything goes. Now you're monitored, now you're tracked, now you're jailed, now you're surveilled, and in some cases, you can lose your life. This doesn't just harken back to COINTELPRO. It is like COINTELPRO on steroids. And we know what happened when all of this surveillance was illegal during the time of COINTELPRO. So imagine now when it is legal. Imagine now when the standards are being set purposely in the way that Graham has pointed out. Black activists and organizers have already been the targets of harassment, criminalization, and even death. The FBI's BIE classification gives the FBI the justification to take a more open and active lead role in the surveillance and intimidation of Black activists and organizers. We were looking before at local working with the FBI, but the local was the one in front. It was Los Angeles Police Department. It was New York Police Department. Now it's going to be the FBI. Now it's going to be federal agents that are going to be taking that role. And they have the kind of surveillance and investigatory tools that can attack Black activists and organizers in more frightening and pernicious ways. The federal government's surveillance capacity is astounding. You know, we just found out that the Geek Squad was hired by the FBI. So for activists and organizers who took your computers in to try to get them fit, the Geek Squad paid FBI agents and were paid by the FBI. So they're fixing your computer and downloading off of it. So this corporate collusion, whether it be Facebook, whether it be airlines, whether it be Geek Squad, also puts Black activists and organizers and increased danger and speaks to the heightened sophistication and invasive reach of the FBI surveillance tools. So it's therefore not surprising that Black activists and organizers report evidence of increased governmental interference with their cell and home phones, as well as their internet accounts. We're being watched, followed by law enforcement in marked and unmarked cars at protests, at community events, at community centers, and at our homes. We're being photographed by people we don't know who are driving cars with government plates. We are being threatened with bodily harm, threatened with death in anonymous calls, in mail, and social media posts. We are openly being called terrorists by law enforcement, police chiefs at public meetings, marking us for further harassment, and worse, by law enforcement and racist white supremacist civilians who take something like this BIU classification and just take it to town in terms of supporting their violent efforts against Black protesters. The first BIU prosecution has already begun, and the tactics used by the FBI and the Department of Justice to pursue, investigate, and prosecute this test case reveals the malicious and constitutionally violative nature and intent of the BIU classification. Christopher Daniels is being prosecuted by the Department of Justice in federal court in Dallas, Texas, right now for the federal crime of illegally possessing a firearm, even though he legally possessed the weapon according to the open carry state of Texas where he lives. It's clear from the written words of the investigators and the U.S. Attorney General prosecuting this case that the Department of Justice is not prosecuting Mr. Daniels because he possessed weapons. They're prosecuting him because of his political views and his constitutionally protected expression of those views on Facebook, views which they would fallaciously describe as Black identity extremists. While there's no competent evidence that Black activists and organizers are engaging in violence against police officers or even civilians, there's ample evidence of white nationalists, white supremacists, and alt-wrong groups engaging in violence in their efforts to accomplish their political goal of making America white again. These groups have appeared at community meetings, immigration rights clinics, town halls sponsored by elected officials, and even city council meetings, usually armed with weapons such as poles, pepper spray, and even guns, have attacked nonviolent protesters, organizers, and event attendees without facing the criminalization faced by nonviolent Black activists and protesters. Rapper, musician, and activist Ted Poe reported to us that the surveillance of Ferguson activists forced him to move and relocate. For a while, he said he was depressed and suffered from constant mental trauma. He remarked that we're told in one breath it's our constitutional right to protest, but at the same instant, we are locked up and charged with crimes. None of my charges have ever held up in court, he said. We've walked away with not guilty charges on every single arrest I've acquired while protesting. So this tells me off the rip, the tactics and the charges are paper thin. I often wonder why actual hate groups aren't attacked, arrested, and pursued the same way we are. Then I realize they're right, and that's a part of this country's lineage. It's legal here to be a part of a pro-white hate group and illegal to organize against them. The demand must be made that the FBI retract and renounce its BIE classification and end its treacherous and unconstitutional effort to suppress and persecute Black activism and organizing in support of Black lives.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of the witnesses for your testimony, and now we will go to questions from the members on the panel here. But let me just say that we've been joined by the ranking member of the Homeland Security Committee, Benny Thompson. We've been joined by Hakeem Jeffries from New York, who's also on the Judiciary Committee, Lacey Clay from Missouri, and the co-chair of the task force, Mark Vesey from Texas. Why don't I begin with Terry Sue?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question really is about solutions. So, do we have a precedent that this peer? It's to you, Mr. Chairman. My question: is there any precedent with this peer review, committee, and the FBI actually denouncing and withdrawing these kinds of classifications? Can you talk a little bit more about how one would go about instituting that?
Sure. Not within the FBI, certainly. But if you look at the intelligence agencies, they do have a process of withdrawing information once they realize it's bad, right? So this is a process that anything that calls itself an intelligence agency should do. If we have bad information, we need to remove it. Unfortunately, the FBI is a cumulative organization. They want to keep everything they got and get more. And even if it's bad information, for some reason they feel like holding on to it is important. But when you might remember in 2009, Department of Homeland Security report about far-right extremism was released, and it correctly, in my opinion, got a lot of criticism because it was overbroad in how it characterized the groups that were violent. And they instituted a program where their privacy officers, the liberties officer, and general counsel reviews these documents before they go out. So there is something internal. I still see a lot of really bad DHS reports, so it's certainly not perfect. And what I would argue, there's nothing in this BIE report that can't be public, obviously. And there's no reason it shouldn't be public. And there's certainly no reason that you all shouldn't have seen this document. I can imagine a situation where you have access to all the materials that they produce, that they produce. And if they're sending this out to state and local law enforcement officers, certainly the members of the Judiciary Committee and Homeland Security Committee should be able to. Right, exactly, the intelligence, obviously. So that would provide an extra layer of oversight, because if I'm writing something and I know my member of Congress is going to see this, I'm going to be a lot more careful in how I make my argument.
Thank you.
Mr. Richmond, do you have a question?
Well, I don't know if it's more of a question than a statement and observation, but the ranking member of Homeland Security joined me in the letter just yesterday because we're afraid to call what's happening in Austin domestic terrorism. And the question is whether it's based on who the victim is or who the perceived perpetrator is. So my question would have been similar to Terry Sue's on what are the next things we can do to combat it. And I think that this caucus, and you see the interest with so many members here, that we want to make sure that we protect people who are out there trying to protect others. And what is very alarming is that in our meeting with the FBI, either they didn't know or they wouldn't admit that all of these things were going on. And that's why I'm glad you brought up the real life examples. And the more we can find more examples, we need them because we're going to ask about each and every example that we have, because the testimony given to us was that there was not one case of using this report to, and maybe they use the word investigate opposed to the word assess. And we'll ask about both, but the question is just, can you continue to work with us to get us examples, each and every person that we find is being assessed or investigated based on this DIE report.
Thank you, Chairman Richmond. We've been joined now by Congressmember Andre Carson, and Mr. Carson is a member of the House Intelligence Committee as well. Did you want to respond to Chairman Richmond?
Yes, thank you so very much. When we're trying to gather this information, and by we, I'm describing Justice Warriors for Black Lives, which is a community collaborative that we formed in Los Angeles in direct response to the criminalization of Black activists and organizers in Los Angeles, to sort of fight on that legal front line to protect folks and keep us from having a bunch of political prisoners coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement. And getting the information from people about what's been happening with them. Do they feel they've been surveyed, and do they feel they're being investigated? Was difficult. People are afraid. They're afraid to even think about the fact that when they logged onto the computer and they got a notice from Google saying your computer's been accessed by, or your account's been accessed by a computer in Virginia. And they're like, but I live in LA. And I haven't given my information to anyone in Virginia. And they don't want to talk about it because they feel like if they speak it, then the worst will come, right? And so we are working hard to get that information. We're hoping to be able to go nationally and do that. But the CBC also, the help that we could get is for members to make it clear that, hey, we want this information, as Representative Bass has done in LA. That helps a lot.
Before I go to Mr. Johnson, let me just say that I think one of the differences maybe between the 70s and now with COINTELPRO is that there was nobody to talk, nobody to say this to. You couldn't really come forward. You just had to accept the harassment quietly and hope that you survived it. But to me, I think that the best way to protect people, and especially the new generation of activists, is to shine the light of day on this, is to talk about it, is to bring it forward. Because I think some of the things that happened to many of us in the 70s, it would be hard to happen now if the public was aware of it. Representative Johnson.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I would like to inquire the FBI intelligence assessment, which is entitled Black Identity Extremists Likely Motivated to Target Law Enforcement Officers, has a publication date of August 3rd, 2017. Is this a report that can be attributed to the Trump administration, or is it a study that began prior to the Trump administration?
I don't know the answer to that question. Certainly the language that the FBI used prior to that was black separatist extremism, which also was not accurate. Right, there aren't really a lot of black separatist groups out there, and the ones they identify as black separatists aren't really black separatists. It's this kind of, if you're black and protesting, we're going to lump you into a category, and they're trying to find an umbrella that covers it all. So I don't know that it had, I don't know how deep down it went. So I can't say whether there was some change, but I will say that right around the same time, May 10th, 2017. The FBI published an assessment on white supremacist extremists pose persistent threat of lethal violence, but it severely undercounts the violence coming out of the white supremacist community, which is an odd juxtaposition why they're amplifying one threat and somewhat putting a blanket on another threat, which of course coming as the black identity extremists assessment did right before Charlottesville certainly didn't seem to be the issue that they should have been focused on.
Yes, okay, thank you. This document is law enforcement sensitive. What does that mean, and what does it mean in terms of the public being able to have access to it, and how was this, how did this end up in the public domain?
Law enforcement sensitive means that it goes out, obviously, to law enforcement. It's usually not publicly available. It's usually not in a redacted format, but in one that local law enforcement can look at it, meaning that since they don't have security clearances, they can still read it. This document, I believe, was leaked at some point in August, and that's how it got out. And what's interesting is that even though it is law enforcement sensitive, if you look at the footnotes on the items that are highlighted throughout the report, they're heavily redacted and don't identify sources, people, organizations that they consistently refer to throughout the entire report.
And these are public sources that they failed to identify.
Correct, Congressmember. And as a matter of fact, I had graduate students go back and look at these incidents and dates that are cited in the report. And they very easily found out who was involved, how many people, what their names were, and the organization they were allegedly attached to.
And so are you saying that these 6 incidents that are noted in the report are inaccurate or inaccurately portrayed in the report?
Congressman, yes, they are certainly inaccurately portrayed, and if we could take the time, I'd be happy to, but I'll just say as a cover, looking at each individual one, clearly each one seems to point to anti-government sentiment. You've got incidents here where they talk about groups that they fail to identify. They loosely talk about how these individuals acted in furtherance of a racist or a racial supremacy movement, which is not identified. They routinely refer to the Moorish Science Temple, and I can tell you that the Moorish Science Temple came out years ago and publicly disavowed any connectivity to any anti-government or supremacist organizations in the country. Now, while we've seen some sovereigns who happen to be African American associated with MST, they disassociated themselves with that, so they publicly denounced them, and they use that as a connection here throughout the report. What's really interesting is how, as they talk about in a couple cases, an individual reportedly, going back and doing some research, we found out who those people were, and if you look at it, they have no connectivity to a racially supremacist or racially motivated ideology.
Well, the report itself says or admits that it's been rare over the past 20 years, black identity extremist violence. The report says that it's been rare over the last 20 years. That being the case, why do you believe that we are now seeing this report that postulates that increased violence is likely? Why are we getting this report now?
And then Mr. Johnson, I'm going to move on to Watson.
I think to reiterate the comments of my colleagues here, because of the climate that we're in politically, and in terms of the national space, it's fitting a theme that we've seen from this administration. And I just think it fits, for lack of an academic way to say it, fits the script.
Thank you. Anyone else want to respond to that?
Well, I mean, just briefly, it's clear
Thank you. It's clear from the time that Black Lives Matter started that it was portrayed as some kind of terrorist organization. And all of the organizations connected and targeting the Black lives in the same way. And that was part of the campaign promises was, hey, we're going to uplift cops and we're going to deal with these terrorists that are protesting against them. And it seems that this report is just right in line with that mentality and those promises.
Representative Watson.
Madam Chairwoman, can I just follow up just quickly?
Quickly, and then we'll move on to Watson.
Okay, thank you. Are you saying then that it's your belief that the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement is a causal factor in the release of this report?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's directly connected, yes.
Thank you.
Representative Watson.
Thank you very much, and thank you for bringing us together, and thank you for your testimony. It's scary. So I could conceivably be a BIE just because I've spoken out against the injustices of and any one of us here could be. And so while we have some very specific definitions of white extremist groups, We don't really have that, with the exception of, is Black Lives Matter identified as one of these extremist groups, or is it just sort of associated with the discussion?
It seems that it's associated with the discussion. They haven't said specifically. In fact, when asked, if I recall correctly, the answer has always been, "Oh, we're not sure. We got to look into it. We got to talk back." But we know what's really going on.
So this is very timely discussion because I serve under Representative Thompson's leadership on Homeland Security, and forever and ever and ever we have been trying to get this committee to recognize that our threats come from white supremacists more than sort of any other group, including so-called jihadist Islamists. So this is a very timely report. I guess I got two questions. Number one is, how do we get to know what the intelligence communities do as a process to correct the misinformation they have regarding groups that they found that they were not accurate about? Because we'd like to introduce that to the FBI. And number two, it seems to me that we have a lot more work to do with the FBI to have it justify why it's done this report and hold it accountable. And I guess the third thing is we very much need to have them give us the information upon which they make these decisions that seem to be based upon no real evidence. So I'd like to ask you, Mr. German, I guess, about the process. How do the intelligence communities correct this? How do we get this to the FBI?
So the way the CIA would do it would be to send a notice to everyone who received the original reporting, withdrawing it, saying that reporting was wrong, here's the correct information, please remove that table from your system. The FBI doesn't have a system like that. And worse, once it goes out to state and local law enforcement, it's in the ether. And we've seen similar reports to this coming out of the intelligence fusion centers that exist all across this country. And of course there, the oversight is even less. So, one of the things that I think would be very important to do is to go to those fusion centers or to their representatives and make sure they're not taking this. Because I've already seen this information, or this lexicon being reproduced at that level. And once it starts spreading among state and local law enforcement, that's where you're going to see the irrational fear that's created by this turn into actual action and potentially violence.
Thank you very much.
Representative Thompson?
Thank you very much, and I thank you and Congressman Beasley for pulling this together. To a lot of us, this is harassment 2.0. Some of us lived it in the 60s and came to Congress, got our FBI file, and saw those activities that we were involved in as young, impressionable college students was actually identified somehow as communist-inspired subversive activities. Well, I was just a Mississippi boy who finally figured out that I was just like everybody else, but my government attached another label to me. Well, here we are, fast forward, using another label, and the dissemination of that document to a 5-member police department in Belzoni, Mississippi, is a dangerous document because of the sourcing of it. It must be true. So therefore, we created a perception that all these terrorists that are doing all these bad things are black. And there are no other people out here doing that because it must be true because the FBI sent it. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been sent. So the question for me is, now that this document's there, what does that say for this country in terms of what potential dangers lie and what is the alternative now that it's there? And it's a policy issue, but for a lot of us who kind of deal with it every day, it's a real challenge. So can you just address that part of it? And good to see a couple of you that I've known for quite a while. Dr. Good seeing you. Please, Dr. Struggle, start with.
Congressman Thompson, the potential danger is quite serious. As you know, having served as an assistant chief of police and in the FBI, I can tell you that when I was a police officer, anything we received from the FBI was taken with the utmost seriousness and as a priority. This document has been distributed to 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, some of whom have intelligence capacity. So when they get a document that speaks to the issue of potentially domestic terrorism, and they're given some allegedly guidelines on what they're to look for, this ups the ante with regards to people that they might come into contact with and possibly detain, prosecute, surveil, and all the other activities that my colleagues have described. So this is quite different than receiving a be on the lookout notice for someone who's committed a crime. This is about national security. And so when it goes to local police departments, it's quite serious. And you can bet, as you described, the 5-member department of Mississippi, they've got this, everybody's been briefed on it. And when a crime's committed, they probably are going to go through a mental checklist to say, does this fit the assessment we got from the FBI? And if it does, now that crime has been elevated to something in terms of homeland and or national security and severity.
Well, I'll back off on it. But the other thing is, I could be targeted because I fit a description of, quote, a potential black identity extremist. So without even committing a crime, I could just get stopped because of my hairstyle or my dress. And I think that's the danger of pushing a document forward like this, is the unintended consequences or intended consequences that you get from that.
And I think what's important to recognize about it is that one of the attributes is political participation, right? That somebody stepping out and making their voice heard becomes a threat to the government under this sort of reasoning. And particularly in the way that we have seen how protests are policed. The type of policing that occurred in Ferguson was very different from what occurred in a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville. And what's the justification for that when the violence in Charlottesville was certainly a lot higher than Ferguson? And that's happening across the country. At the Brennan Center, we've been doing some FOIA work trying to get information about this. But over the last 2 years, there were white supremacist rallies in Sacramento, in Anaheim, in Huntington Beach, and in Charlottesville, where you didn't see the kind of policing that we saw at Standing Rock, that we saw at Ferguson, that we saw here at the J20, the inauguration protest, where hundreds of people are being arrested, here charged with felonies. We don't see that kind of thing when there's actually violence happening, when people are getting hurt. So I think there needs to be a deep look at how our police are policing protests by their different ideologies, treating them very differently.
I just want to add something briefly as well.
I'm not used to this thing yet. I just want to add something briefly as well. It's not just the small towns. I'm concerned about places, not just the small towns, but places like Los Angeles, places like New York, where you do have that increased surveillance capability and intelligence capability. And so with LAPD, they have the stingrays that zap the information out of your cell phone. They have predictive policing, where they try to figure out ahead of time what's going on with you and then engage in these assessments and investigation. They have a fusion center in Los Angeles. So they have a whole cyber unit that we found out about when we were doing these activist cases. All they do all day long is look through people's Facebook, social media, look through people's email accounts, take pictures, and make files up on people. And so this type of BIE report has a significant effect. We know in Los Angeles has been sued for LAPD spying on people before. That was, I think, in the 80s. They been sued. And, they were a lot of different organizations that they had infiltrated, that they had surveyed, leaving cards on people's doors, real hardcore stuff that folks thought had ended with COINTELPRO. And that's LAPD. And so having this information, they're already doing this before BIE classification, and having this information now, we understand it's life-threatening, and that is not an exaggeration.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson. Representative Clint?
Thank you, Representative Bass and Beasley, for conducting this hearing. Thank the witnesses for being here. Let me start with Professor Suthers. The history and culture of law enforcement in this country has a long record of targeting African Americans for prosecution. And in this era of Trump, this administration has really gone after the credibility of the FBI. So, as legislators, I know I'm torn about, are they credible or not? And so it points to a bigger issue, I think, about what reforms are needed in law enforcement in this country. I mean, I know there's a culture that we need to address in law enforcement. And would it be helpful to start somewhere like with the President Obama's report on 21st century policing? Is that where we start as legislators to start addressing what needs to shift in the culture of law enforcement throughout this country? I'll start with you and let each of you try to give us some guidance.
Congressmember, thank you. It's interesting that you refer to President Obama's 21st century policing report. The 6 pillars that are identified in that report are definitely issues and items that were identified by a host of law enforcement community members, attorneys, people across the country with regards to what needs to be addressed. And that report should be seriously looked at. As Mr. Durham mentioned previously, transparency as it relates to the degree possible with the FBI is critical. I never thought I would be at a point in my life where the FBI would be considered a deep state. But that's where we are, and it's very unfortunate. But I will say again to your comments about local law enforcement, we've got some other issues here. Before Charlottesville, we had the Unite the Right movement sharing photographs and identification of people that wanted to participate in counter-protests with law enforcement, with hopes that those people would be arrested. In our own backyard, Nana and I, in LA, we have a new group called Rise Above Movement. They are a white supremacist movement. They are very violent. They are in towns that typically host volleyball players and surfers, and they travel. They've been to Charlottesville. They've been to Sacramento. They've been all over the country. They are so bold that I was going to show a video about a month ago to a class from the Rise Above Movement, and they had, in less than 2 weeks, put out a new video of themselves and what they were doing. They're hanging banners from our overpasses and the freeways in Los Angeles. They are named individuals that in 2 cases I can cite that were involved in violent assaults and have not been arrested and or charged. So they feel this brotherhood with law enforcement, which is particularly disturbing, that we know who they are and what they've done and no action's been taken. So we have even more work to do with the credibility of law enforcement at the local level when they find out about these crimes and they refuse to pursue
So
them.
we need to go towards the chiefs of police and the heads of those police departments and bring it to their attention.
We absolutely do.
Okay. Go ahead. Anybody else you want to try to address?
I think that's very important. One of the things that when I speak to law enforcement audiences, the people that are involved in this aren't people who are unknown to law enforcement. These are people with felony records. These are people who have other violent crimes on their record, and yet they're able to travel across the country going from protest to protest, putting videotapes of the people they beat online. I mean, this isn't, some very secretive group that nobody could find. I could track them from my office in the Bremen Center. So certainly why law enforcement isn't following up the way they are so aggressively. I mean, they're still prosecuting people from the Standing Rock protests.
Well, and also I just saw last week that the young man who was beaten almost to death in Charlottesville was acquitted of his crime of assaulting.
Right, but probably has some bills and probably, that went some cosmic pressure that was put on him by going through that. So I think that there is a more serious problem, and I think it's very important, particularly in this era, that we empower our state and local representatives so that they can do some of this oversight that maybe isn't going to be done in the federal government. The San Francisco Police Department withdrew from the Joint Terrorism Task Force over issues about their intelligence activities. Oakland also has limited their participation, and so I think making sure that our state and local representatives have information so that they can do the oversight that maybe the federal government isn't as interested in.
Okay. All right. Again, thank you so very much for this question. In terms of these hate groups, they monetize hate. So when they're putting these videos up, they're not just putting them up for people to watch. They get so much money per hit. So they actually have commodified hateful violence, white supremacist violence. They turned that into something like a vending machine that you can get. They've made this vending machine video set that they have where people are paying to watch this. And the fact that there's that audience that will pay, or the fact that they can get it paid for is pretty amazing. But I wanted to say, when you're talking about what kind of reforms and what can be done, that I would advocate for the people, that there needs to be conversations not just with law enforcement, because law enforcement is not going to provide the solution. Law enforcement is trained to be a certain way. There's a culture. They train themselves, so that perpetuates the culture. It's hard, and I'm an attorney. It's hard for me to think outside of my way sometimes. I have to work on that. And how I get out of that box is by talking to the people. That's how I get out of the box. And the people who are most affected need to be the people, that voices that are the loudest and who are given the greatest platform. And if you ask the people who are most affected, black folks that are in our communities, black trans people, black people that are immigrants, for example. We talk about African Americans, but the police don't just focus on African Americans. We know that, and we've known that, right, in terms of who's been killed. It includes black people from the continent of Africa, such as myself. It includes black people in the Caribbean. So it's blackness that is and the anti-blackness that is the motivation for this behavior. But what are people talking about that are the most effective? They're saying demilitarize the police, which means not just taking away weapons, but you're having all these police officers that are being recruited from the military, where they have engaged in whatever they've engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they come here, you give them the same weapons. In San Bernardino, we had a helicopter officer who literally tried to stop a car chase by shooting from the helicopter. Now, that is not supposed to happen. Maybe that happens in Fallujah and it works out, I don't know, because I don't know the rules of war there. But in San Bernardino Freeway, that's not supposed to happen. But that's what happens when you have militarized personnel and militarized weapons together. They're talking about defund. Let's take some of this money. Most cities have 51% of their budgets, it's like they calculate it to a T, that they are putting into law enforcement. The houseless situation in Los Angeles, $100 million, $85 million was allocated for law enforcement to address houselessness. This overfunding of law enforcement doesn't help. We need to defund, we need to demilitarize, and then one day, hopefully, in the words of Harriet Tubman, abolition will come. But until abolition, which is why we still have to deal with law enforcement, we should at least have the focus, reimagine public safety so that it's not so law enforcement focused.
Thank you.
Representative Carson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the panelists. We talked about law enforcement. I can remember I worked in the Fusion Center as well. We talked about law enforcement. I remember being in the police academy and there was a young man in a separate squad from my own who had a shirt on during one of the emergency vehicle operation courses. He had a picture of Stalin, Mussolini, and Hitler on the shirt. And we reported him to one of the training captains, who was dismissive at best, and the gentleman simply said, well, I don't agree with everything Hitler says, but he did do some good things. And this was in '98, and this was kind of the culture, and might a lot of the unearthing that needs to take place, at least in terms of that. Now, most of these folks in police academy, statewide police academy from different agencies, were from rural parts of Indiana. But might a lot of the unearthing that needs to take place, it probably should start at the police academies where we train our analysts, whether it's state police analysts or FBI analysts or other analysts, where a lot of this data is coming from. Might we need to start at the academies and at the training centers in terms of educating the analysts and even recruits?
I think that's the perfect place to start. It is obviously, as you know, for people who are going to get the beginnings of their training, there should be a zero tolerance for that kind of behavior. It's interesting that I was at the United States Air Force Academy 3 weeks ago, and General Silveria had an incident there earlier this year where an African American, a couple of doors were defaced with racist epithets, and he took it on 5 minutes speech about if that's how you feel, you shouldn't be here. And to hear that from a 3-star general sends a message. And so they should be hearing this in the academy. And as you know, there are officers that with tattoos that certainly espouse a certain ideology, with T-shirts that espouse a certain ideology, and they don't lose that when they get sworn in. And so that should be rooted out. And the screening process should be able to catch that and take care of it. I can tell you, if we speak for California, there's no shortage of people applying for law enforcement agencies. So we should get the best people. And Mr. German mentioned earlier, there needs to be some transparency. I, too, am very disappointed with the numbers of people of color and women in the FBI. I came in 4 years before Mike, and we had greater numbers than we do now 40 years later, 30 years later. That's very disappointing. And when you have, these are the agencies that are enacting and engaging, carrying out these policies. Well, unfortunately, the people carrying out these policies, they're against people who don't look like them. And it makes much more an easier task. We can certainly point to some successes in local law enforcement in major cities across the country when those agencies start to reflect the demographic of the people they serve. And I wholeheartedly believe in that.
And I would just add that in addition to training the people coming in, it was a supervisor who signed this document out. Right? And it's really about leadership. And I've been disappointed that the director didn't immediately withdraw this report just because it's bad analysis. Right? I mean, even if you think that the nomenclature is fine, this is just poorly written, poorly analyzed document. It has no place in an institution of the professional caliber of the FBI. So it really takes leadership and making sure the leaders get it on this issue.
It's hard for me to respond. Thank you. It's hard for me to respond to that because I think that it's not broken. It was meant to be this way. And so when you look at the history of law enforcement, you look at the history of policing in this country, this is what policing was meant to do, right? And so as long as as this model continues, all you can do really is tinker. It's like dealing with racism, dealing with poverty, right? This country was built on certain things. If you just tinker, it's not going to be enough. And this is why we advocate abolition. Let's start again. Scrap that. Let's reimagine public safety. Let's look at how we can address public safety concerns in another kind of way, because the tinkering, it's been tinkered with. The body cameras, people have body cameras, and people are still getting acquitted. People are being trained. They know. We see videos of a white person with an axe in one hand, a gun in the other hand, a bazooka with the left foot, and some kind of machete with the right foot, and somehow they're able to subdue this person without killing them. And then you have someone pull out a lighter or pull up their wallet that's a black person, and they're shot 46 times. It's not a training problem. It's not a leadership problem. They know how to operate when they're dealing with white citizenry, with white folks in this country. As soon as the people are not white, suddenly there's all these new rules and new ways of operating. And so it's just rotten to the core, and it needs to be thrown out.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carson. So I would like to ask a couple of questions, and then I want to refer back to my colleague, Mr. Johnson. I want to know if each of you could speak to recommendations that you might have for the Congressional Black Caucus or other members of Congress as to how we proceed next. So we have spoken to the Attorney General, we have spoken to the head of the FBI, we've spoken to Rosenstein, and we asked a couple of specific questions. Number one, we wanted to know how a document like this would be generated. What part of the FBI generates a document like this? And then how do you get it retracted? How do you get them to say, okay, this is the department, and we're not asking for names, I think you understand what I'm saying. How do you get to the source of it? Because how did you even come up with this category to begin with? So if you start there, then assuming, as I think all of us do, that this is faulty, then how do you get it retracted? What do they do? I think you said 18,000 law enforcement agencies had it. I think, Mr. German, you said a couple of times that you're seeing this pop up in local law enforcement. What exactly does that mean? How did you see that? And then they told us, every single person told us that there were no investigations, right? Mr. Johnson, you were there through all that. There was no investigations. They didn't say there wasn't surveillance, because to me, of course, you do surveillance so that you get the information to do investigations. But now we know about the individual from Texas who's been incarcerated since December, and Black Identity Extremism was used. But now I hear that there might be other cases, and I want to know if you know of any other cases, but specific recommendations for us. Why don't I start with Mr. German, but each of you please answer.
So the way I know is that I'm working with a lot of other activists and with journalists who, when they are using FOIA and get FBI documents particularly, but all law enforcement documents, there's not a lot of people who have my kind of experience that can interpret them, so they send them to me, so I see them. The Intercept recently published a piece that included some of those documents that showed how this language is going downstream. Just yesterday there was a report in I believe it was the Intercept also, working off of the Center for Civil Rights FOIA on Black Lives Matter that shows physical surveillance taking place. And they're highly redacted, so it's hard to know what's going on. But if you FOIA information about Black Lives Matter and you come back with a surveillance document, in law enforcement we call that a clue. So, certainly there are investigations taking place. We've had the door knocking. We've seen that in advance of particular protests where the FBI shows up at somebody's mother's house or shows up at their workplace asking questions, which is just an intimidation tactic. So I don't know how they're separating this BIE assessment. Again, I think it's just the extra factor that's out there. That if I'm looking at this person and all I can see is that they're Black and they're engaging in First Amendment activities, but there is this movement, I can get past it. One of the things I would ask you to look at is the FBI's racial and ethnic mapping program. This is a program that went into place in 2009 under the Attorney General Mukasey guidelines in 2008.
Racial mapping?
Racial and ethnic mapping program. And usually the FBI is good at providing some kind of name that sounds not nearly as obvious about what it is. But when I was at the ACLU, we produced some of the documents that came from it, and it was a San Francisco document said, historically, Chinese people have been involved in organized crime in San Francisco, so we're going to map where all the Chinese live. That, in Georgia and Atlanta, there was one that tracked the growth of the Black population over 15 years to find Black separatist extremists. This kind, it's neighborhood profiling. And obviously, the reason why they're drawing the map is because they're going to treat the community on one side of the line differently from the way they treat the
white folks?
It's very unclear from the documents. Certainly not in the broad way. I mean, it's interesting, like it came up when in one of your hearings where you were questioning Director Ray, where he was equating black identity extremists with white supremacists. And it's like, no. White supremacist isn't anybody with a white identity, right? You're talking about a very specific community versus black identity is pretty much anybody. So, and I think that how they characterize these things comes out of the mentality that would create a racial ethnic mapping program. The idea that people of certain races have different criminal proclivities based only on their race and ethnicity. And that's just factually false. It's bad intelligence that's being sent out. And it only contributes to this idea that it's us against them. And when the FBI is looking more and more like me, them is people who don't look like me. And that's a problem.
Thank you. Mr. Sutherland? Dr. Sutherland?
Well, two things, Congressmember. And first, I want to applaud you and your colleagues for the pressure on this. The pressure works. I happen to be President Obama's nominee in 2009 when the report that Mike referred to, produced by the Department of Homeland Security's Intelligence and Analysis Unit on right-wing extremism, came out. Constant pressure on Secretary Napolitano got that report removed, got that unit disbanded. It identified in it was the fact that returning veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan would be prime targets for recruitment by white supremacist organizations, and certain members of Congress took great issue with that. And she apologized to veterans and withdrew that report. And then, unfortunately, things they predicted in that report started to come true about 2 years later. The other thing I would like to point to on the local level is, let's go back to the 21st century policing document put together by the Obama administration. That's one of the finest community-based documents I've seen in my career with regards to what we could do going forward. There are 6 pillars that are clearly identified. It was very comprehensively put together by a group of people across the country. I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel. I think we should look at trying to implement it. And I can tell you that many agencies across the country are using that document to change their policies and processes for community engagement. And it's already there.
Thank you. So 2 things that I would highlight. Firstly is I think it would be important for our representatives of CBC to meet with folks locally, meet with activists, meet with organizers, and maybe even have some sort of hearing where we're talking about what's happening so people can feel safer to talk about their stories and really feel like, yes, we have some kind of cover, right? Because people are afraid of retaliation, even from their jobs, that maybe the people at work don't know that they're involved in this protest work. So if they speak up and say, I'm being surveyed by the FBI, their job might be like, really? Okay, well, you don't work here anymore, right? So they're like doxing themselves. And so having that, I think, would be very important. And then the pushback, pushing back against criminalization of protest. When you have this, when you're hearing about potentially the creation of a federal crime where you could get 10 years in prison for getting arrested at a protest, that it's going to be a felony. The things that were clearly misdemeanors, if bad at all, now become felony cases, felony conspiracy cases, and with the FBI taking the lead, these being federal crimes. And so we know what that means when, I almost said something else, when Jeff Sessions decides that mandatory sentencing should be back on the books. So you combine that with now creating it, making it a crime to do a protest and making it not a crime to run people over who are engaged in protest. Right. Those ways, the CBC can be really helpful with that kind of pushback in terms of legislation and policy that is clearly intended to criminalize, to help with more surveillance. So it's like, let's push back against the surveillance, let's push back against the militarization, let's push back against the criminalization of activists and protesters, black activists and protesters that are really trying to move us towards a more just society that this country claims it wants to be.
Thank you. Representative Johnson?
Gosh, I've heard so many things so many thought-provoking things that you all have said, and I've heard from my colleagues up here. I again want to thank you, Congresswoman Bass, for hosting this event. I hope it's not the last one. And I hope it, as you say, I hope that we take it to the people. We don't do it just here in D.C., but we take it out into the hinterlands. Lack of diversity in the FBI. I was looking last night